Lies Marxists tell about World War II. There are many lies that Marxists tell about World War II. For instance, that Lend-Lease didn't have an impact, that the Soviet Union beat Hitler alone, that there wasn't a second front, that Japan surrendered because the USSR entered the war against Japan, that the Soviets had incredible, overwhelming manufacturing, and that the T-34 tank was the best tank in the world. Like all Marxist lies, once they're shown to be nonsense, they tend to go in hibernation, but like a zombie, they get repeated and brought back to life later. For instance, outside of World War II, the ozone hole and the population bomb. Marxists keep recycling these over and over after they've been shown to be nonsense. They never really die. We never put a wooden stake through the heart of these stupid Marxist lies. The supposed tech billionaire Roy Singham rehashes these World War II Marxist lies again in a paper he just put out. This paper is entitled 80th Anniversary of the Victory of the World Anti-Fascist War, acknowledging who truly saved human history and restoring historical truth, was put out by Neville Roy Singham. He argues that the Soviet Union and China, rather than the United States and the Allies, were the primary agents in defeating fascism. He recycles all the Marxist lies that have been brought up about World War II. The one that I'm going to focus on is the idea that, in fact, the United States Army would have not been able to fight on the Eastern Front because it would have been overwhelmed, because the Eastern Front was both geographically large and the size of the armies would have just overwhelmed the United States because they were much bigger than on the Western Front. And that had there been a war between the United States and the Soviet Union immediately after World War II, the U.S. would have been beaten badly. But before we get to that point, let's just take a look at Roy Singham's paper. Singham is described as a tech billionaire. He made his fortune from an IT consulting firm called ThoughtWorks, and he sold out for $1 billion. This story sounds as crooked as a $3 bill. There's precedence for this. The whole Facebook Zuckerberg story is pure fraud. Facebook was and is a CIA operation from beginning to end. Zuckerberg was not a brilliant entrepreneur. Facebook was not better than MySpace. The very day that DARPA shut down the project called LifeLog, which was very similar to what Facebook became, Facebook started. Coincidence? I don't believe so. The deep state has had their tendrils in social media companies from the very beginning, including Google. And note that Peter Thiel was an early investor in Facebook. Peter Thiel has been shown to be a deep state tool and is behind Palantir, which is the most dystopic company ever created yet, and is taking over the whole Defense Department. So the idea that Roy Singham started his own business organically just does not pass the smell test. It almost certainly was a money laundering operation from beginning to end, and as soon as he cashes out, he ends up moving to communist China and throwing a bunch of money at Marxist causes like this insane paper about World War II. The first thing to note about Singham's paper is that he suggests that fascism and communism are the opposite of each other. They are the exact same thing. They are just various different strains of the same goddamn disease of collectivism. So the very premise of his paper is bullshit from the beginning. But he repeats this dishonest Marxist myth that somehow communism is fundamentally different than fascism, and capitalism is fascism. Here are some of the chapters of his paper. The first chapter is entitled The West's Deliberate Delay, a Strategy of Treachery. So because the West didn't join the war immediately, the West was on the side of the fascists and Hitler. So the West is evil. Note that Singham is so stupid that he thinks Hitler's National Socialism is fascism. The West was evil, and therefore the credit goes to the Soviet Union and China for stopping fascism. What a bunch of fucking nonsense. His next chapter is When Inter-Imperialist Rivalries Mattered. The next one is about economic power in 1941, entitled The Myth of Western Might. This is so insane, it could be categorized as a mental illness to bring this up. Next is China's 14-year resistance to the forgotten foundation of victory. China didn't do anything to stop Japan. If Japan had not attacked the United States, Japan would have had complete free reign in China. Next is the blood price. This is a standard Marxist talking point. The USSR and China actually won the war because they had more people who died in the war. That's not the standard for who wins a war. That's a metric that shows just how poor the Soviet Union and the Marxists in China were at fighting. They were so bad that they lost huge percentages of their own population. The next chapter is entitled The Soviet Union Destroyed Fascism in Europe. Yeah, again showing that he doesn't understand the definition of words. First of all, Hitler wasn't a fascist. He was a National Socialist. But fascism and socialism are just variants on communism and socialism. This guy's dumber than a box of rocks. And he made $1 billion in an IT consulting firm? Yeah, I just don't buy this bullshit. The next chapter is entitled China's Demographic Catastrophe. I don't know what this chapter is about. Next is the Colonial Holocaust. 11 million erased. Next is how socialism defeated fascism through superior strategy. Die and throw lots of your people at them because you don't think that any person has any value except the state. That's a superior strategy. That's the strategy of slavery. And he goes on. Here are some other chapters he talks about. This paper is just insane. And it shows how Marxists love to revive and remanufacture things that have been proven to be nonsense. They love to reiterate these lies over and over again. Another example where they've done this is with DDT. Everything that Rachel Carson said was known to be incorrect at the time she wrote it. And yet the Marxists keep bringing up this DDT myth as if it's supposedly a great win for environmental socialists. In fact, it's a great win for having killed off billions of people who would otherwise be alive today. It's the most anti-human event in history, killing even more people than Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot combined together. As Javier Milei says, as long as Marxists keep repeating the same lies, we'll keep repeating the same truths. I could go on about the idiocy and why Neville Roy Singham's paper about World War II, which he rebranded as the war against fascism, is false, but that's not what I wanted to focus on. I want to focus on the lie that Marxists tell about the Soviet Union was the reason that the Allies won World War II, and the U.S. was irrelevant, and the U.S. would have been destroyed by the Soviet Union. First and foremost, we have to look at the economies of both countries. The economy of the U.S., even after 9 years of FDR, the socialist scum, trying to destroy the U.S. economy, was still the biggest economy in the world by far. During World War II, the U.S. possessed a massive industrial advantage, with the GDP often more than double the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the U.S. economy grew significantly from 1940 to 1945, while the USSR's economy did not grow. The economy of the USSR was roughly the same as Germany's throughout the war, as this chart shows. This chart also shows that the Allies' industrial advantage was more than 2 times at the start of the war and more than 5 times by the end of the war. Thus, the U.S. economy dwarfed the USSR's, and had there been a war between the U.S. and the USSR at the end of World War II, it would have been overwhelming. with the U.S. having more than a 5-to-1 advantage against the USSR in the economy. There's no way that the USSR could have even thought about competing against the USA. Even these numbers are a little bit misleading because, in fact, the USA's GDP per capita was much higher than the Soviet Union, and thus they were able to free up more resources from farming and maintenance sort of issues for the war efforts. U.S. industry outproduced Axis in artillery 900,000 to 180,000, tanks 230,000 to 50,000, and aircraft 370,000 to 125,000. The U.S. had over 110 million tons of crude oil, compared to less than 40 million tons for the Axis. An example of the industrial power of the U.S. is that they launched a massive fleet of over 107 aircraft carriers and thousands of other ships. Japan could only build a handful of ships. In fact, the U.S. provided about 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. So to suggest that the USSR in any way stood a chance against the U.S. after World War II is just complete nonsense. Marxists argue that the U.S. could not have competed on the Eastern Front, which is just Marxist hogwash. I've even heard this nonsense from a guy who attended West Point, showing that Marxism has even penetrated the U.S. military academies. The United States produced 2,710 Liberty ships from 1941 to 1945, an average of 3 ships every 2 days. The U.S. produced transport ships faster than the Germans could sink them, even when the Germans were having their most successful submarine attacks in the North Atlantic. This video shows the U.S. versus Japanese ship production throughout World War II. It shows how the U.S. just completely destroys Japan in the production of ships, and that Japan clearly had no chance against the U.S. given its industrial power. If that industrial power had been turned against the USSR at the end of World War II, there's no way that the USSR, with an economy that was smaller than Germany's by itself, won a war against the U.S. What this really shows is the productive power of people who are free is overwhelming compared to the productive power of people who are slaves. Another related Marxist lie about World War II is that Lend-Lease was not meaningfully helpful to the USSR. This is complete nonsense, and somehow Roy Singham uses the data to make an argument that Lend-Lease shows racism against certain groups. As shown in this chart, this is insanity. The choices of Lend-Lease were where the value of these materials could do the most to win the war. It had nothing to do with racism. This is a standard Marxist technique. Everything is always racism. They love to use this smear. Under Lend-Lease, over 400,000 trucks and jeeps were provided to the Soviet Union, and roughly 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 rail cars, plus over 50,000 tons of steel rails, which was more locomotives than the Soviets produced themselves during the war, and approximately 8,000 tractors for both agriculture and heavy artillery, and 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, including almost all the high-octane aviation fuel used by the USSR in World War II, which could not refine its own high-octane fuel. Over 38,000 machine tools and approximately 14,000 planes, including the T-39 Arakoba, favored by Soviet aces, and the B-25 Mitchell bombers, and about 13,000 tanks. The other lie Marxists love to tell is about the incredible industrial production of the Soviet Union. Every one of the factories that was involved in the production in World War II by the USSR was first created and designed by American and Western firms. Albert Kahn, who had designed Ford's massive plants, built over 500 factories in the USSR. So the USSR does not deserve credit, nor does Marxism and communism deserve any credit for the supposed industrial might of the Soviet Union, which, by the way, even with the help of the US, was not able to produce an economy that was any bigger than Germany's. The supposedly best tank of the war, the T-34, was designed and created by an American called Walter Christie. The U.S. provided 2.4 times more locomotives than the USSR produced domestically during the war, ensuring that Soviet logistics would have ground to a halt had it not been for the U.S. and Lend-Lease, and they would have never had these factories had it not been for the U.S. Also, interestingly enough, despite Singham's point of view about industrial companies working with Nazi Germany, they clearly worked the Soviet Union and the communists, so there was no supposed favoritism to Nazi Germany. And this also is based on the idea that there's a difference between these two evil collectivist systems, which there isn't. They're the same fucking thing: systematic slavery. So could the Soviet Union have survived the onslaught of Hitler's army had it not been for Lend-Lease and the American and British help? It's doubtful. The Soviet Union was a backwards agrarian nation, technologically unsophisticated. Even by its own inflated statistics, its economy was no bigger than Germany's. So the whole idea that the Soviet Union won World War II because of its massive Soviet industrial might is once again shown to be Marxist propaganda. Another idiotic lie that Marxists like to make is that the Soviet Union and China deserve credit for winning World War II because they had the most deaths or casualties on their side. This is actually Roy Singham's argument. You don't win wars, as Patton said, by dying for your country. You win wars by making the other guy die for his country. This is just Marxist nonsense. The Soviet Union was so bad at fighting that they lost about 7 million soldiers and almost another 17 million non-combatants. This is maybe 30% of their population wiped out during World War II. By contrast, the U.S. only had 400,000 deaths due to the war, and they fought a two-front war, unlike the Soviet Union. So the U.S. military was infinitely more effective at achieving its goals in terms of manpower. This means that the U.S. lost around 1% of its population. Canada and the UK, also in contrast to the USSR, had very small percentages of its population that died in World War II, whereas China had 20 million people that died in World War II, or according to their own estimates, up to 50 million people. That just shows you that these countries had very ineffective armies. This is not a sign of success or something to be proud of. Only a Marxist could turn this disaster into a supposed badge of honor. Once again, showing just how weak the Soviet Union was, and how there was no way that they could have stood up to the U.S. if there had been a war between the two after World War II. Another Marxist myth is about how great the Soviet generals were. They were not great. The Soviet Union's army at the end of World War II was just a ragtag group of marauders living off the land. They didn't have these brilliant military encirclements that they love to talk about so much. Those are the result of German incompetence more than brilliant Soviet military strategy. General Patton would have easily taken Berlin by Christmas of 1944 had Eisenhower and Roosevelt not stopped him from doing so. Patton was a much better commander, as were many U.S. generals, than the Soviets, in part because they had much better capabilities because their strategy was based in freedom and treated soldiers as valuable. They had much better equipment, they had much better logistics, they had overwhelming air power. In fact, had there been a war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union after World War II, it most likely would have been a very short affair, even without the use of nuclear weapons, which is another point. Technologically, the U.S. was much superior to the Soviets. The U.S. was economically superior, they had better equipment, they had better military leaders. This Marxist lie needs to die. We need to put a stake through the heart of it. The fact that this Roy Singham brings this up again is insane. But what do you expect from a Marxist who appears to have been a fraud and has made his money through money laundering? The idea that he made and started a successful tech company is just Marxist bullshit. So it's obvious the Allies and the US could have destroyed the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, and probably should have. So what should the Allies have done? Well, when you find two enemies are going to war against each other, destroying each other, the last thing you do is intervene to try to stop it under the theory that your enemy's enemy is your friend, which is just the stupidest argument under the sun. But because FDR was a Marxist socialist scum, and FDR's administration was full of Marxist sympathizers to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had also penetrated the British government, they made sure to impede the Allied advance to increase the territory gained by the Soviets. They helped the Soviet Union when they should have just allowed the Soviet Union and Germany to beat each other to a pulp. The reality of this situation was that the economies of both these countries were about the same size, and given the vast territory of Russia, it almost certainly would have been a war of exhaustion. Even if Hitler had been able to take over the oil fields in the Caucasus, it would not have extended the life of Hitler's regime much, and therefore would not have enhanced the Nazi regime's ability to defend against the Allies in the West. Most likely, if the US and Allies had just allowed these two totalitarian collectivist evil countries to fight it out, Russia would have had to eventually sue for peace, and given the exhaustion of Germany, they probably would have accepted this. This would have allowed the Allies to attack Germany on the Western Front and run them over, because Germany would have been completely exhausted at that time. But as I said, Marxist sympathizers in both the US and in Britain were determined to make sure that the Soviet Union was not overrun, and that it would become a big world power after World War II. This was treason. This sort of treason showed up in other areas. In fact, one of the examples was not allowing Patton to close the Falaise Gap, which would have allowed the Allies to win the war by Christmas of June 1944. The Allies would have easily been to Berlin, and then they could have easily pushed into Eastern Europe before the Soviet Union got anywhere near there. This same sort of nonsense is what allowed Market Garden operation to happen. Instead of allowing Patton, who was already at the Siegfried Line, to keep attacking, they stopped Patton and they gave all the resources to advance Montgomery's plan, who was a completely useless and incompetent general. The failure of Market Garden caused the war to last another 6 months longer at a minimum. 6 months in which the Soviet Union was allowed to take over all of Eastern Europe, and due to the treason of FDR and the treason of the Potsdam Accords. Luckily for Austria, Patton ignored his orders to stop at the Austrian border, which was then saved from being completely captured by the Soviet Union and living another 20 to 30 years under the terror and the evil of the Soviet Union and communism. Potsdam was a complete stab in the back to the Polish people, who the Allies had supposedly agreed to defend at the start of World War II. It was complete treason for all the Eastern European countries to allow the Soviet Union to take over. This was a humanitarian crisis and genocide on a scale that's unimaginable, and shows the moral decadence of FDR and the Allies, and was completely avoidable. The geopolitical implications of this treason were that Eastern Europe, from 1945 until 1990, was under this murderous, evil regime of communism run by the Soviet Union. On top of it all, then we also had to deal with Cuba becoming communist, which created untold misery in South and Central America, exporting their evil communist crap. It also resulted in the Korean War, in which Truman either was a coward or was actually just like FDR, a socialist sympathizer, and instead of allowing MacArthur to win the war, which is what he should have done, the US allowed North Korea to become one of the most miserable places in the whole world. The US always talks about democracy, fighting wars for democracy and freedom. The US completely ignored the fact that it completely abandoned and betrayed the people of North Korea. This led to the Vietnam War. The CIA purposely undermined the US and US military objectives in Vietnam, and what was a completely winnable war, and again resulted in untold suffering and genocide to the Vietnamese people and other people in Southeast Asia. The failure to deal with the Soviet Union and the communist threat that it presented resulted in a permanent deep state in the U.S., which has completely undermined and gutted the U.S. Constitution, continues to do so to this day, and it created the military-industrial complex, which is now spending the U.S. into bankruptcy. It also resulted in the Kennedy assassination and the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. The Kennedy assassinations were almost certainly organized by the CIA, which is an evil Marxist organization, and they also attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan. From the very beginning, the OSS and the CIA recruited Marxists from the Frankfurt School out of Columbia University, which was just a school that pushed Marxist critical theory down the throats of Americans by hiring a bunch of Marxists from Europe. And through the CIA, Marxist agendas were pushed around the whole world. Not once, when I've investigated the CIA, did they talk about Locke, Jefferson, or the Constitution, and yet they pushed all sorts of Marxists to the forefront, including Gloria Steinem and a number of other Marxists. The implications of not dealing with this threat that was caused by the Soviet Union and communism at the end of World War II created the civil rights issue, created the welfare state, which has destroyed the American family, and created the Department of Education, which now indoctrinates U.S. kids into more Marxist wokeist theories, created the LGBTQ movement, created modern art and music, including supporting Andy Warhol, which destroyed art and music, especially classical music, resulted in what are generally known as the drug wars, including crack, heroin, and LSD, which the CIA was involved in dealing and profiting from. Through MKUltra, we know that the CIA not only pushed LSD, but they were experimenting with using LSD for mind control. They also, in their cultural Marxist push, denigrated American inventors and destroyed the American manufacturing base. The cultural Marxists that were allowed to survive because of the stupidity of allowing the Soviet Union to survive World War II destroyed U.S. universities that were world class. Now they're just institutes of Marxist propaganda. This also resulted in the recent push to allow men in women's bathrooms, Epstein, and pedophilia running rampant among the political class in the U.S. It also resulted in the wokeification of Hollywood, destroying American entertainment. The failure to deal with the Soviet Union and communism at the end of World War II, like Churchill and Patton had suggested we needed to do, which was a complete betrayal of the people of Poland and Eastern Europe, means that we are now in the middle of World War III, having to fight the cultural Marxists, including the WWF, the UN, NGOs, and all these other world organizations, which are not interested in peace, but destruction of the West. These organizations, like the UN, from the very beginning, have wanted to create a one-world government to dominate and enslave the rest of the world, doing it through things like climate change. Their ultimate goal, which they've stated out loud, is to reduce the world population by 95% and make sure that the other 5% live at the same level as savages with no technology. So in conclusion, the US and the Allies could have easily have dealt with the stupidity of the Soviet Union and communism after World War II. Instead, the Allies put off that issue, and it's been a constant problem since, and is now resulting in us having to fight World War III, which is a fight for our very existence. Long live freedom, damn it.